There are many things that can be said about Phantasy Star Online. It is the first MMO to ever be playable on a home console. It was way ahead of its time, featuring an addictive loot system and RPG mechanics that kept people hooked, grinding away what little content there was. And then repeating everything when the next re-release came around. It was light on story, but the stories created by the players were much more personal and special. Naturally, like any other pioneer in gaming, it'd spawn copycats. One of these copycats happens to be the topic of today's video. Digimon World 4, or Digimon World X as it was originally titled in Japan, is a looter RPG heavily inspired by Phantasy Star Online. This isn't just me saying it, the game has many blatant similarities. The game features a main hub, where all your stores and important facilities are. There is a dedicated headquarters, which you need to visit to progress through the story. And a teleporter, sending you towards one of 4 areas, each having 3 different difficulties. In these areas there are logs of a previous party recording their findings on their own expedition, after they lost contact with HQ. Just like in Phantasy Star Online. They even display the sprite from the original virtual pet toy, it's very cute. There is no online component, but if you have the multi-tap, or play the GameCube or Xbox version, up to 3 players can join you on your grinding adventures. The combat, compared to PSO, is relatively fast-paced. You can jump for some light platforming, something PSO2 would shamelessly steal 7 years later.
Jump action.
Each weapon has a basic attack, a charged attack, a spinning attack, a block, and a dash. Some of these require unintuitive button combinations to perform and are therefore unreliable in the heat of the moment. Which is weird, right? Some of the buttons of the controller aren't even mapped and could have alleviated this issue. The block button is good at blocking ranged attacks. The charged attack is useful when dealing with breakable obstacles, but in combat its use is very limited. A limited skill set isn't a problem as long as there are weapons to modify it. Unfortunately, the weapons themselves are all just simple stat sticks. Instead, each Digimon comes with a variety of techniques to breathe more depth into the combat. You can unlock higher rank versions of techniques by spamming them over and over. Something Phantasy Star Universe would shamelessly steal a year later. The maps are slightly different compared to PSO. In PSO you have one static map. You traverse through it, kill the boss, go to the next area or start doing side quests. Digimon World 4 has a bigger emphasis on the world. Each area consists of a few areas with 2 to 3 dungeons you have to tackle before being able to fight the final area boss. Sometimes an area also has a gimmick level, like the New May River or the train. Exploration is highly encouraged. This makes the world feel much larger than it actually is. The dungeons themselves are unfortunately very uninspired. Aside from 1 or 2 decorative pieces, they all look largely the same. This is very unfortunate, because all side quests recycle these dungeons. In the same vein, PSO recycles its main areas for side quests. But in the case of World 4, the recycled content is also the blandest content in the game. I would love to have quests that take place in the world itself. The story is probably this game's weakest part. I personally don't care that the story isn't a gripping tale like in a JRPG. Frankly, the story in previous Digimon games wasn't that incredible either. What disappoints me most is that this game, despite being part of the X Antibody multimedia project, and having scenes from the X Evolution movie in its intro cinematic, barely has anything to do with it. The main antagonist is some weird mecha, and the X data is supposedly turning Digimon into these mecha, but that's not at all how it is portrayed in the VPET lore, movie, or manga. Dorumon isn't an important character, and there is no sight of Deathxmon and its pre-evolutions. Yggdrasil is completely absent as well. Lord Nightmon and Dynasmon do show up as bosses in the 4th area, and after beating the game, Ophanimon and Seraphimon expressed concern that Royal Knight members were involved in spreading the X data, but that's about it. Maybe an Episode 2 re-release could have fixed some narrative issues, but unfortunately we'll never know. While adapting the formula to the Digimon franchise, a few tweaks had to be made. For example, Digivolutions aren't really evolutions, they're classes. A thing that many fans of the franchise take issue with, since they expect a linear evolution progression, only to unlock one of the 4 Digimon you can pick at the character creation screen. But for what it's worth, it's really cool that you can play all classes on a single character. Something Phantasy Star Universe would shame. Some Digimon specialize in buffing, some in debuffing, some in healing, some on pure damaging abilities. The only issue is that unlocking these can be quite a headache. First you have to rescue Leomon, which in itself already requires you to beat most of the first area. Then you have to take the boat, and rescue all 10 Digi Elves. They will populate the main hub, and once you become strong enough or complete some arbitrary task, like collecting enough cards, they will give you a side quest. You then have to complete these side quests in order to unlock evolutions, but which ones you get, depends on which Digimon you selected at character creation. These classes naturally start out at level 1, but because the class select system is labeled as evolution, starting out at level 1 feels really jarring. Luckily power leveling is incredibly easy in this game. 2 of the best spots to farm EXP are in the first 2 areas, and the experience values are very generous. What is missing from PSO are photon blasts, and this is where I think the devs should have looked to previous entries for inspiration. Digimon World 3 already had a system called Blast Evolution. After taking enough damage, your Digimon would blast evolve for a short period of time, causing some serious damage to your opponent. It's really weird that the developers didn't implement this system here, as it would be right at home. Similarly, Digimon World 4 lacks mags. These little devices were basically a secondary stat leveling system in PSO, and would evolve depending on what stats they had at certain thresholds. Digimon does feature a secondary stat leveling system, namely that in the form of X data, but the prices are way too steep to justify, and they only give you a single point at a time. I found that it is better to spend these points in upgradable mods, even if they get replaced once you get to the next difficulty. Each difficulty significantly improves the drop rate of X data, and thus makes it more farmable. However, the cost for upgrading stats with X data scales with your level, which is very unintuitive. Digimon usually fight weaponless. Usually. In this game, they run around with swords, axes, and guns. A change that can be jarring, but was necessary to make the game work for the genre. After all, loot is a very important pillar of the core gameplay loop. However, despite being so important, loot in this game is unfortunately very underwhelming. There are 6 weapon categories in the game, though technically there are 10 if you count the dual-wield variants as separate. Each of these categories has 5 individual weapons, not counting starting equipment or signature weapons, which are a different can of worms. We'll get into that later. Looking at this, you might think that such a tiny roster of weapons isn't looking good for a looter RPG. And you'd be correct. To combat this, each weapon comes with different suffixes with better stats. So, if you play Vmon, like I did, the first equipable sword, the long sword, will have the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and epsilon variant. Once you've outgrown these weapons, only then you move on to the next weapon, the war sword. The suffixes don't change the weapon's appearance, which is very disappointing. At the very least, they could have changed the color. Vmon is a slash weapon specialist. Specializing is this game's version of section IDs. A system designed to alter your loot, so you don't drop the same things as other players. Except in Digimon, it doesn't affect your loot, it affects your shops. If you're a slash weapon specialist, you'll have way more slash weapons listed in the shop menu. The more weapons are listed, the easier it is finding rare weapons. Which works really well in my opinion. It always kept me invested in checking the shops, and I was always motivated to farm money to afford these rare weapons. Slash weapons have 2 branches, one-handed swords and dual-wielding swords. On paper, the dual-wield option may appear superior with its higher attack stat, but the damage values are split between 2 swings. Additionally, I noticed that the dual-wielded swords swing ever so slightly slower. The main difference between these 2 weapons is that one-handed swords increase speed, which increases your accuracy and dodge rate. Meanwhile, the dual-wielded swords increase magic attack. So one feels catered towards melee gameplay, while the other feels catered towards magic. Vmon has some powerful spells, so I ended up preferring these over the alternative. To keep the gear somewhat exciting, each weapon can drop with a random amount of mods, and a different color. Mods are absolutely vital to make these weapons more powerful, since this is your only weapon customization system. They are similar to augments in PSO2. There are mods that give your weapon elemental damage, higher crit rate, HP or MP steal, flat stats, or elemental resistances. Some mods are exclusive to weapons, some are exclusive to armor, and some can be used on both. There isn't a great deal of variety in terms of mods, which is a shame. Since we're only having so few weapons, it would be cool if mods could make each weapon feel unique depending on what you slot in, but there are so few options your weapon will basically always look the same. Then there are weapon colors. Almost every item can drop in one of 5 different colors. These colors increase the main stats of your equipment, and the amount increased is random, but it also scales with your level. It is impossible to get a green item to drop if you are level 29, for example. At this level, it is only possible to drop blue items that increase the stats between 1 to 30. In order to get a green item, you need to be at least level 30, and even then you'd get the lowest amount of stats possible. Since this system is so dependent on your level, it won't be something you'll have to worry about until higher difficulties. The level cap is 999, so if you want to get best in slot gear, you'll be farming for a while. Now that we've broken down all of the loot mechanics, and you have somewhat of an idea of how much RNG this game has when it comes to weapons and armor, let's talk about signature weapons. Signature weapons are unique weapons for each playable Digimon. Veemon's signature weapon is the Lightbringer. Obtaining it is fairly simple. You know, just beat every single boss in the game on hard or very hard difficulty without turning off your console. I am so glad we have save states these days, because good lord, that is a ridiculous requirement. After you do this, an overpowered Numemon will spawn in the first area, and you need to kill it. And after all this work, it is very likely the weapon will drop without weapon color, and without mods. At least the weapon isn't best in slot, otherwise people would lose their mind farming it. The weapon is really just for flexing. Though, with how tiny the weapon roster is in this game, I'd prefer if there was a system in the game that allowed us to add mod slots and weapon color onto our weapons for the price of X data. It feels wasteful to have 16 unique weapons be just for flexing, when the weapon roster is so tiny. Personally, I find the game very enjoyable for what it is, despite its shortcomings. The devs attempted to bring the Phantasy Star formula over to Digimon with very mixed results. However, many people didn't feel as charitable as I did. When I first played the game with my cousin, nearly 20 years ago, I remember really enjoying my time with the game. I was only on a short visit, so I wasn't able to play much, but the game left a strong impression on me. A few years later, I finally got internet access, and it was quite shocking to me to see the discourse around this game being so negative. People are touting this as the worst Digimon game ever made, the Dark Souls of Digimon games, and things like that. Personally, I dislike Digimon World 2 more, but don't tell anyone. I watched a decent amount of videos criticizing this game, and I can't say I'm impressed. See, complaining is easy, critiquing something constructively isn't. To me, someone who likes Phantasy Star games a lot, it really just comes off as if a lot of people just don't get it. Phantasy Star Online never gets mentioned in the discourse with this game. The closest you get is someone mentioning Diablo loot, but they don't develop that thought any further beyond that. Like, if you haven't played the game yourself and just watched people shit on this game, you likely never saw this dodge attack, or the fact your techniques evolve over time with use. This is why I went so thorough in this video. I just don't see many people interacting with the game mechanics, which exist for a reason, then proudly announcing the game is bad and punishing, when it really isn't. Unironically, I see this game compared more to Dark Souls, simply because you leave your cash on the floor if you die, and have to pick it up again. A mechanic demon's souls would shamelessly steal, for years later. But in terms of difficulty, I really didn't find the game all that difficult. For this video, I only died like twice in the first area, then never again. I even beat the final boss on the first try, and he could kill me in 4 hits. The thing is, once you reach a certain level, you basically have infinite healing. Every Digimon you can choose at the beginning of the game learns Heal Light, at some point. This trivializes any difficulty this game would have ever had. I also made sure to beat the first area on hard difficulty, just to get a perspective for how things ramp up. The difficulty issue, if you want to call it that, isn't that much different compared to previous Digimon World games. These games have always been terribly difficult until you figure it out, or consult GameFAQs. How many of you who played Digimon World on the PS1 had their Agumon evolve into Numemon as your first evolution? Come on, there is no shame in admitting it. For those who don't know, New Maimon was an evolution you would only get if your rookie level Digimon is too weak to meet any of its intended evolution requirements. You might think it was a pity system, but no, your New Maimon would be weaker than before evolving. Digimon games used to be hardcore. I really think people simply approach the game from a wrong angle. Like, I can't play a racing simulator the same way I play an arcade racer like Need for Speed, right? The whole looter RPG genre is way more popular in Japan, so it really didn't surprise me to see that Japanese Amazon reviews from 2005 were overall positive. A shared sentiment I see with people who do enjoy this game is that a version 2, or perhaps a episode 2 re-release could have made this game way better. Even a simple ROM hack could probably fix many issues. Digimon World 2 has a pretty kick-ass ROM hack, so why stop there? After all, Phantasy Star Online version 1 wasn't perfect either. It was very buggy, clunky, and lacked a lot of quality of life features. The game would also probably play better on a PSP than on a home console. Having to share one screen when 4 players are sorting their inventory is a little bit clunky. This would also be a cool opportunity to add some social features, like maybe some emotes. The HUD for other players could also be reduced in size, since it doesn't have to cater to the needs of 4 players simultaneously. And it's a real shame that because of the fan reaction to this game, Bandai will likely never bother making another looter RPG in the Digimon setting. It also doesn't help that Bandai is absolutely terrible at selling Digimon products. Why was the name change necessary? Keeping the name as Digimon World X would have signified this as a spin-off, and temper expectations. Look how sick the original logo is compared to whatever this is. Or whatever these are. There is no mention of Phantasy Star Online on the back of the box either. PSO fans are the main target demographic for this game, so why isn't Bandai marketing the game to them? As if that wasn't enough, Digimon games are always poorly translated. Chrome Digizoid suddenly becomes Clone Digizoid. Luck is translated correctly in the description, but not in the item name. Even Cyber Sleuth suffers from this, where the translator mistook the word Bakemono with Bakemon. Something even Google Translate gets correctly. One of the fan translators for Digimon World Redigitize applied at Bandai, specifically to translate Digimon games, and he was declined. Bandai simply doesn't give a shit about Digimon.
Okay, you guys, we're on to our last segment. And it's a real good one. I heard someone say Digimon, you were funny.
Yes, very funny. I can't contain myself. Why do I bring all of this up? If you're familiar with the Souls series, Demon's Souls was originally panned by Yoshida-san for being a bad game, a conclusion he came to, after being stuck in the first level for hours. Because of this, the game wasn't published by Sony in the West, and got much less marketing as a result. For its sequel, From Software went to Namco. They got strong marketing support that emphasized the game's difficulty, and the game became a mainstream success, despite not being easier than its predecessor. Bottom line is, I don't think Digimon World 4 is a bad game. It's definitely not as good as PSO due to all the issues mentioned throughout this video, but there is still a lot of fun to be had with it. At the end of the day, that's all a game really has to be. I personally really enjoy it, and it's a real bummer we will never see a game like this from Digimon ever again, simply because most people hate it for things it's not trying to be. Recently Bandai put up a survey asking what genre of games Digimon fans would be interested in. Souls-like was a selectable option, and my tweet where I shopped Imperial Dramon over Elden Beast got a pretty decent amount of likes, so I wonder if they'll dare doing it. If Digimon World 4 is being compared to Souls games, then I really would love to see how an actual Digimon Souls-like would look like. But that's about all I have to say about the game. This is probably the only Digimon-related video I'll ever make, simply because of how closely related it is to PSO. Hope you enjoyed me yapping for however long this video is. NGS content will resume as always, and... hold on. Booster packs? I can't believe NGS would shamelessly steal this feature 19 years later! Huge shout out to my lovely channel members. I love all of you guys. I'll see everyone in the next video. Take care!